All right, we are now recording. So this session is recorded for the public record. Welcome to today's public forum. So our agenda for today, first we'll do the usual introductions, and then we have a presentation which is essentially an abridged version of the one which Eric Merriam, our project manager, recorded, which is up on YouTube. We'll put maybe we can put a link to that in the chat for those of you who haven't seen it yet. But you can also get that link by going to the project website, which is honolulu.gov/alawai. So you can always go there, and in the yellow banner area on the front page, all the links that you need for today are there, so you can view that full version of the presentation there. Today we'll give a shorter version of that, just in case folks haven't had time or haven't been able to look at the longer one yet. And then after the presentation, we will have a listening session. And so a big part of why we're doing this today is because this is part of the scoping period, public comment period, following the publishing of the Notice of Intent to do a supplemental EIS in the Federal Register, which kicked off the NEPA and HEPA processes. So we want to make sure that folks have an opportunity to provide those comments verbally or in chat if you would like to do that, in addition to submitting them via email and the other ways that we have, which we will get to later in the session. So our presenter today will be Eric Merriam. He's the project manager and the study lead. Cindy Akpal and myself will be facilitating. We also have Zach Hartley on. He's the planner for the project. I'm sure he'll help facilitate and watch the chat and things like that. So for discussants from the City and County of Honolulu, Hawken Millis, the director of the Department of Design and Construction, is on, and his Deputy Director Brian Gallagher is also on. And I see some other folks from the city in the participant list as well. So they're here and they're listening. So before we really get started here, I just want to issue an apology. Those of you that are on our mailing list for announcements, and if you're not on that list, again, go to the website, honolulu.gov/alawai. You can sign up there. It's primarily for announcements, but we occasionally send out other communications. I sent out one a few weeks ago apologizing for the fact that we didn't use that same mailing list to notify the community as soon as we published the Notice of Intent in the Federal Register. We should have done that. It was obviously an oversight that we regret very much. Given the fact that we've tried very hard to be transparent and to build or rebuild trust with the community, we take that very seriously. So we have discussed that amongst the team to make sure that we don't do that again. And also we extended the public comment period on that NOI to ensure that folks have an opportunity to provide comments and feedback. So I just wanted to make sure that everyone got that message. So during the presentation today, just as folks have been doing, if you can post your comments and questions in the chat, or if you want to just hold them until I have breakouts there still. We're not going to have breakouts today. We'll just have an open listening session after the presentation. So it'll be the full group. So again, keep your audio on mute during the presentation. If you're having difficulties, you can put it in the chat, or you can send me an email. And hopefully, yeah, I'll try to check that email periodically to make sure that nobody's struggling with anything. From this point, we're we'll start the presentation, and I'll hand it over to Eric.
Thanks, Tyson. And good evening, everybody. I'm gonna wait until the slides progress. Okay, sorry, they just moved for me. So we, again, as Tyson mentioned, are just planning on providing a shorter version of the presentation that's up online. We'll provide that link to everybody in the chat here today. And so what I really want to do is just start off with the objectives this evening. So throughout the scoping period of the study, we've worked together to identify these three objectives. The first is to reduce risks to life and safety associated with direct inundation of structures and transportation infrastructure. And this kind of gets back to the fact that there are, over 200,000 residents that live within the watershed, and many of those folks live within the floodplain, and thus have elevated life risk. The second is to reduce economic damages associated with the direct inundation of structures and public infrastructure. And the third is to reduce economic impacts associated with the disruption of commerce and tourism. So I wanted to highlight these three objectives because Tyson, you can go to the next slide. Really what we'll do now is just, this isn't the video, but it is a map of the 50-year inundation extent. And so you can see that essentially the flood patterns that occur throughout the watershed. And I'll highlight kind of how the flooding occurs, because ultimately that determined how and why we developed the plans the way that we did. So let's start up in the Manoa Basin. So you can see in the Manoa Stream, just upstream of the Woodlawn area, there is inundation in that community, but the main source of flooding throughout the lower portion of the Manoa Basin occurs at Woodlawn Bridge, right? We've talked a lot about how the stream jumps its bank there and it flows down through the university area, ultimately ending up in the Makoli Mo'ili community. As you travel downstream, there is flooding at the Manoa and Pololo confluence in the community there. And then as you travel south into the Manoa Pololo Canal, flooding essentially occurs on both sides of that canal and jumps the banks. On one side, it flows into Makoli Mo'ili. On the other side, it kind of, it flows to the Mauka side of the Alawai Golf Course. And then as you move down to the canal, essentially, floodwaters rise and go over the banks along the canal for its entire length, impacting the Makoli Mo'ili area, the Waikiki district, the Ala Moana neighborhood. And then the last area I'll talk about is up in the Makiki Stream. Along the Kanaha Ditch, we have water that jumps the bank there and ultimately flows down through the Ala Moana neighborhood. And you also have flooding kind of emanating from the Makiki Stream all along the stream itself. And so you can see that there are areas essentially throughout the watershed where flooding originates from the stream itself, ultimately impacting the neighborhoods. And so all of those areas I just spoke about are areas that we specifically targeted when we developed the array of alternatives that we presented over the course of the past several public meetings. So Tyson, next slide, please. And so I just kind of summarized the three what we call structural alternatives. So the structural measures are things that modify the nature of the flooding. And so these are the three structural measures that we have. The first is alternative one, which is the storage alternative. And again, this just focused on maximizing storage and existing green space throughout the watershed. It had storage detention facilities in the Makiki and Manoa Valley District parks, as well as the Alawai Golf Course. And then it had a number of other flood walls to address remaining flooding. The alternative 2B is the conveyance through the use of flood walls alternative. And you can see here essentially, obviously we have a lot more flood walls. It's the flood wall alternative as opposed to a detention facility at the golf course. We're essentially just allowing it to flood. And we have flood walls along the length of the Alawai Canal, around the entire Alawai Golf Course, and then essentially up the Manoa Pololo Canal. We have flood walls at the Woodlawn Bridge, and then up along the Kanaha Stream in association with the Makiki District Detention Facility. And then at the confluence of the Manoa Pololo streams, again, to kind of tackle some of those areas of flooding that I just talked about on the previous slide.
Excuse me, can you point to what you're talking about? We don't know which ones you're pointing at, you're talking about.
So,
Hi, yes.
Jason, I don't know if I have.
No, we don't have the ability to use a pointer in this particular version.
So what I'll do then
Can you
is I'll
tell
go to
us
the.
which picture you're looking at, you're talking about then?
No, that's great. So let me start over. So if I go all the way over to the left, the storage alternative to the left side, so alternative one, the image all the way to the left on the slide. Again, this is the alternative where we try to maximize storage of existing green space. So all the hashed blue areas that you can see, there's three of them. One of them is very small in the Makiki Valley Detention, or the Makiki District Park. But then the Manoa Valley District Park up kind of in the top right-hand corner of that map, and then the Alawai Golf Course kind of in the lower right, the lower portion of the map, those larger blue hashed areas. And so essentially those would be detention facilities where we're storing water. And then the red lines that you see on that map all the way to the left are essentially different flood walls that would be incorporated to reduce flooding associated with those various areas that I talked about on the previous slide. And so for example, the flood wall kind of up to the right hand on that right hand portion of that map, the top right is the Woodlawn Bridge area. And so that flood wall is at Woodlawn Bridge, would prevent water from jumping the banks at Woodlawn Bridge and flowing down through the university area along the Manoa Stream. The next kind of U-shaped flood wall that's right in the middle of the map is right at the confluence of the Manoa Palolo streams. And it would essentially reduce flood risk to the areas just adjacent to that. And then finally, the flood wall along the Manoa Palolo Canal, just kind of on the Mauka side of the golf course, would prevent water from coming out of the canal and flooding out the areas on the Mauka side of the Alawai golf course. So if you shift gears to the middle map, you can see that there are a lot more flood walls. Essentially, as opposed to the detention facility at the golf course, you have flood walls extending the entire length of the canal on both sides, kind of encapsulating the Alawai golf course. In the middle of the picture there, allowing the golf course to function as a natural floodplain, as opposed to acting as a detention facility that would have different features on it. So on the left map, on the storage alternative, the golf course essentially has berms or banks built up around it to increase the amount of storage that you could have in the golf course. Whereas in the middle map, the conveyance flood wall alternative, it just acts as a natural floodplain. We also have the flood walls at the top right-hand corner of that map in the middle on the flood wall alternative, a flood wall at the Woodlawn Bridge. We also have the flood wall at the confluence of the Manoa Palolo Canal, kind of the U-shaped flood wall towards the middle of the map. And then we did have the Makiki District Park to the left-hand side of the middle map, and the associated Kanaha flood wall, again, to try to reduce risk within Makiki Stream as best we could. Those were the only features that essentially were justified in that area. So that's the flood wall alternative. Now, if we shift all the way over to the right-hand map, alternative 5, which we call the hybrid alternative, it's kind of a combination of both. It looks at storage and flood walls in combination to see if they were more effective than kind of either one by itself. And so again, you can see on the hybrid alternative, we have all three of the same detention facilities that we talked about under alternative 1 at the golf course, in the Manoa Valley District Park, and the Makiki District Park. And then we also have flood walls around the Alawai Canal. Essentially, the thought here is that we can only store so much water in the watershed, and so we're still going to need other features, including walls around the Alawai Canal, to reduce risk to those surrounding communities, including Macaulay Mo'ili'ili, Ala Moana, and Waikiki District, kind of those communities in the lower portion of the watershed. And so, apologies. You can see that we still have a lot of the same flood walls along up by the Woodlawn Bridge area. And then at the Manoa-Palolo confluence. And so again, I want to highlight that all of these alternatives have been detailed in meetings in the past in July and in December. And I know that the video for the meeting in July where we presented the initial array of alternatives is up online for viewing. And then we're going to make sure that the December recording is posted online as well, so that you can go back and watch that where we do go into these alternatives in great detail. As well as the presentation that the presentation that I recorded ahead of this meeting has a little bit greater detail on each of these alternatives as well.
A quick question before you leave the slides. Could you please mention the orange and yellow culvert issues?
Yeah, so those are great questions. So the orange and yellow culverts are essentially inlet or outlet culverts. And so in this regard, so the easiest way to talk about it is maybe looking at the culverts that are along the Alawai Canal. So all of these are existing drainage structures, whether they're open ditches or kind of underground storm sewer systems. And so we're not right now at the level where we're proposing modification to those existing features. What we would be doing is adding structures to the outlet of them. So whether it's a flap gate or a sluice gate or some other type of structure that prevents water from backing up from the canal into those communities. So it's essentially putting a structure on there to prevent water from going up. It allows water to come out, so it allows water to drain from those communities. So it's like a one-way valve. It allows water to drain out into the canal, but prevents water from coming up into the canal. And then there are a few of the other ones, like the inlet culverts to some of the detention facilities would be the culvert that brings water in from, say, the Manoa Stream into the Manoa Valley District Park detention or the golf course detention facility. And then the outlet culvert would be allowing the water to recede from those detention facilities once it can do so.
So, Eric, would the detention facility be usable when it's not storming? Will they still be able to go?
Excuse me, can we hold questions until the end of the presentation, please? Thank you.
Yeah, I'll answer that one, but let's try to I appreciate the questions, but let me try to get through this just so we can maximize time for everybody. But I'll answer these because, they're great. So the detention facility would not store water unless there was a storm, and it would not store water unless the storm was to a certain magnitude. So for example, it might be the 20-year event or the 50-year event that starts triggering that detention facility to capture water. And so the remainder of the time, there would be no impact to the facilities. And then it would take a few days, on the order of a few days, say for the golf course detention facility to drain. Right now, we assumed gravity drainage. We don't have any additional pumping or anything like that through gravity drainage. Once the Alawai Canal itself recedes, it would take a couple days for the waters to recede back out into the canal. And then what I will say too, because Dave asked a few questions in the chat, under all of these alternatives right now, the heights of the flood wall and the heights of, say, the berms or levees, like for the golf course detention facility, are assumed to be 6 feet tall. We had chosen 6 feet because, as we had talked about all along, we were tasked with kind of optimizing the greatest benefit per cost. And so through the previous iterations of the study, we knew, again, that the 100-year level, which is what the previous studies focused on, we're probably not going to get there, right? Because those studies were unable to find a justifiable project at the 100-year level. And based off of the analyses that they had conducted, it looked like, somewhere around the 50-year event, give or take, was where we would be able to optimize kind of getting the biggest benefit for the least cost. And so that's why we assumed kind of 6-foot wall, because that's what got us to that level. Now, I will say, moving forward from this point, after we kind of release the draft report with these plans in there, we'll do what we call optimization, and that's where we go in and we start kind of fine tuning what that height will be. So we'll look at higher, we'll look at lower, and we'll say, really, where do we maximize those benefits? And so, you know, the height of the flood wall may change as we do that optimization as we move forward. But right now, all of them are assumed to be 6 feet. Okay, Tyson, move forward. So the only alternative that we had not presented at a previous meeting, because we were still working on the analyses, was what we call the non-structural alternative. And when we talk about non-structural measures, these are things that don't modify the nature of the flooding, but reduce risk by kind of modifying how the floodplain is developed in a way, right? And so these are things like elevation of homes. So the figure on the, so there's 2 pictures on the left-hand side of the screen. The first has a house that's kind of elevated off the ground. You can see, I don't want to say it's on stilts, but that's essentially what it is, right? It elevates the first floor elevation above the floodwaters of, you know, whatever, like the 100-year flood elevation. You can elevate the first floor above that so that the home still, you know, is kind of around the water, but it's elevated and it doesn't have that damage. That's generally done for residential structures. And for non-residential facilities like businesses, commercial facilities, they do what they call floodproofing, dry floodproofing, which is essentially where you put a waterproof membrane around the outside wall. You put in floodproof doors, floodproof windows where necessary. Essentially, these measures that prevent water from inundating that structure. And so, you know, you can generally floodproof up to about 3 feet and prevent the inside of that business or commercial facility from getting wet. And so we looked at application of these non-structural facilities all throughout the watershed. So the map on the right is essentially a map of the watershed, and each reach, so the watershed is divvied up by what we call reaches. These are kind of the reaches that we use to group these measures. And so you can see how those reaches are divvied up. Each reach has a code. The code isn't really that important right now for this discussion, but I have circled 6 of those reaches with a green circle. And those are the reaches where we identified that these non-structural measures would have a positive economic benefit, meaning the cost or the benefit would outweigh the cost from an economic standpoint. And we have talked all along and know that, right, economic benefits are not the only benefits that we look at, but it was a good first step, kind of a first iteration of this alternative. And so just within those 6 reaches, you see that there are about 200 residences that would be proposed to be elevated under this alternative, and about 1,700 or 1,800 non-residential structures that would be flood-proofed. I will say that these measures, so all of those 200 homes, right? It's not a mandatory thing, right? So homes and businesses can choose to opt into these types of alternatives or measures if they want to, if they are given that opportunity. So again, that's just kind of in a nutshell what the non-structural alternative looked like, and we'll compare that non-structural alternative to the structural alternatives on the next slide. So Tyson, if you want to move on to the next slide. So that essentially was the final array of alternatives. Again, we presented that back in December. And the next step then is to compare those, comparing the costs, all of the different benefits. And as I mentioned a moment ago, we don't just look at economic benefits. Basically, recently, the Army Corps has been mandated to look at what we call comprehensive benefits. And so those are benefits that are economic, other social effects, things like reductions in life safety, benefits to socially vulnerable populations. We look at regional economic benefit. So when we build and maintain these types of facilities, we do provide benefit to the regional economy through jobs, through regional income. And then we also look at the environmental effects. And so I'm just going to kind of walk through these kind of benefits categories. So the benefits categories are along the top, and then the plans obviously are the rows. And so if we look at first the national economic benefits, these are the economic benefits that historically drove decisions by the Army Corps of Engineers. And you can see, they're all green, which indicates that they all had positive net economic benefits, meaning that they all had benefit cost ratios greater than 1, or the benefits outweighed the cost. But alternative 5 had the greatest net benefits, meaning that it had the highest return on investment from the economic standpoint. If we go back to our other objectives, so one was to reduce economic damages, another was to reduce the economic impacts to commerce and tourism. And so what we did there is we identified reaches throughout the watershed that were associated with tourism, whether it be the Manoa Marketplace or the Ala Moana neighborhood or the Waikiki district, right? These reaches that we know are important to the local and regional economy, or the state economy for that matter. And so we looked at how well the alternatives reduce water surface elevations or risk in those areas. And when we did that, we saw that alternative 5 had the greatest reduction in risk in those areas that were identified as being important to commerce and tourism. Most important, I'll say, directly. And then life safety risk, we have models that that model the population at risk. So for example, how many people are living or working within each reach during the day or at night, and how does that change? And how many are in the floodplain, right? How many are see floodwaters on their home or business without a plan, and then with each alternative. And we can see how that population at risk changes with each alternative. And again, you can see that alternative 5 had the greatest reduction in population at risk throughout the watershed, or the greatest life safety risk reduction. Alternative 5 also had the greatest benefit to the regional economy. It's the largest plan, and so it would bring in the most jobs for construction, and it would, bring in the most regional income from that standpoint. And then social vulnerability, similar to the impacts to commerce and tourism, we identified those reaches through the use of like the social vulnerability index tool and other tools to identify those reaches throughout the watershed that have the highest proportion of socially vulnerable populations, whether it be folks without vehicles or lower socioeconomics, things like that, right? But what are those most socially vulnerable communities? Where do they exist? And then how well does each plan reduce risk in those reaches? And again, alternative 5 had the greatest benefit to those most socially vulnerable reaches. And then from an environmental impact standpoint, alternative 6, which is the non-structural plan, would have the least impact to the environment. Essentially, you would just be elevating structures in place or flood-proofing businesses. And so there would be really no environmental impact outside of local kind of construction. However, alternatives 5 and 1 would have what we're going to say minimally impactful, meaning they would not be significant effects. We could reduce those effects through not mitigation, but avoidance measures and things like that. And then alternative 2B would be the most impactful. And so if you just kind of look at all of these together, you see that alternative 5 does kind of maximize those benefits across those categories. And so alternative 5 ends up being what we call our comprehensive plan, as well as our national economic development plan, so our NED plan. And so because of that, it's the plan that essentially was moved forward for kind of refinement. And so that refinement then ties into the next slide. What we do next is we say, okay, well, alternative 5 appears to be maximizing those benefits across all those categories, but we have to make sure that each feature is what we call incrementally justified to the extent that we can, meaning that we don't want to just put a feature in because it seems to make sense. We want to make sure that all the features in and of themselves can justify themselves, if that makes sense. And so to the extent that we could, we separated these things out and looked at them individually, meaning that we pulled them out of the models essentially and ran the models without those features in to see how much benefit could be kind of tied to each one of those features, or kind of multiple features where appropriate to combine them. And so without going into too much detail, you can see that essentially when we looked at the Makiki District Park and the Manoa District Park, they did have benefits, right? Which was why that they were included in the plans kind of throughout the alternative formulation process. However, those benefits were not enough to outweigh the costs. And again, we're not just talking about economic benefits. We're talking about benefits across all of those categories, right? We could not justify the inclusion of those measures in the final plan, regardless of the type of benefit we were looking at. And so ultimately, those features, the Makiki District Park and associated flood wall along the Kanaha Ditch, and then the Manoa Valley District Park, were removed from what we're now calling the prospective plan. Now, if we looked at the Woodlawn Bridge flood wall, so the kind of flood wall up in the top right hand corner there, and the flood wall at the Manoa Pololo confluence, we kind of looked at those together because they function as a unit, right? If you keep water in the stream up at Woodlawn Bridge, you're going to have more water in the stream as you get down further, and so we needed to look at those together. And then we also looked at the flood walls together along the Alawai Canal and the Manoa Pololo Canal, and then the golf course detention facility. And so all of those features were incrementally justified, meaning that they had enough benefits to offset the cost or justify the cost of that feature. Okay, so Tyson, moving on. So that leads us to what we're calling the prospective plan today. Again, we are not quite at what we call the tentatively selected plan. We're not at the release of the draft report, so we expect this plan to change. But as of today, the prospective plan incorporates the Woodlawn Bridge flood wall in the top right-hand corner. So you can see it has a little 3 by it, as well as we call it the Quali Road flood wall because Quali Road's right there, but it's at the Manoa Pololo confluence. The golf course detention facility, and the Alawai flood walls around the Alawai Canal and the Manoa Pololo Canal. Again, as I mentioned earlier, all flood walls and levees are right now assumed to be 6 feet in height. The other thing that you can see here is we do call out different road closures that will be associated with the flood walls here. And we also have identified a number of canoe closure structure locations. So again, a lot of that work was done under the previous iteration, but those would also be additional closures that we're looking to incorporate. And then the drainage structures, which there was a great question about earlier. Again, those are like putting flap gates or sluice gates on there to allow water to come out of those drainage facilities, but not go back up into those communities. Again, you can see that it's largely flood walls around the canal and the golf course on half the golf course, but then there is that earthen levee kind of on the lower lower portion of the golf course there. And so that's the prospective plan as it is today. But there are a few things that the team still needs to do. And so Tyson, if you want to move forward. So the next steps, right? So again, I mentioned we're not quite at what we're calling the tentatively selected plan, and we're not quite at the release of the draft report yet. So what does the team still need to do? So we're looking at the potential addition of non-structural measures to this prospective plan. So are there areas that are not addressed by the measures in this plan that could be addressed through implementation of non-structural features? So again, elevation of homes, flood proofing of businesses. We're trying to focus those analyses on areas that are not benefited by the plan that you saw there just a moment ago. We're still working to modify the features that you did see. So the flood walls, and the detention facility, we're trying to modify those a little bit to address remaining risk. So can we, if we modify the alignment in this way, does it reduce risk, to this area that still sees risk? And so we're still trying to kind of modify it in that way. Again, we're not necessarily looking at raising or lowering the flood walls at this point. That will come during optimization. But if we add additional length in one area, is that going to reduce risk enough to be justified? The other thing that we're really taking a hard look at, and we've been directed to take a hard look at, and of course you all want us to take a hard look at, are things like the aesthetics of the flood walls. We do have policy and guidance that kind of mandates that we look at this, right? And so we saw the canoe launches on the other slide. Obviously, we're taking those into consideration. We're looking at how we can incorporate different, facades of the flood wall, make it look nicer, just so it's not a concrete wall. And all along, we've talked about, the potential of adding an elevated path behind the flood wall, so that in essence, it's a 3-foot flood wall on top of a 3-foot walking, running, biking path. And so if you're along that path, then you don't have a 6-foot wall right next to you. You only have a 3-foot wall. So that doesn't necessarily, it reduces the effect to the view shed for those folks recreating along the canal itself. So these are all things that we're actively kind of incorporating into the design and working with our policy specialists at division and headquarters to figure out exactly how these can be incorporated into the plan. We also will be doing internal reviews, technical reviews prior to releasing the draft report. And then, as I mentioned on my presentation online. We are going to be reaching out directly to those folks that are directly affected once we've really nailed down the plan ahead of the release of the draft report. We do want to start those conversations with folks moving forward. And so, Tyson, I think let me know if I'm talking too long. I guess there's not much I can do now.
Good.
So the other thing, Tyson mentioned the notice of intent to prepare an EIS. So we did want to kind of talk about that decision a little bit. So since we spoke last, the study team in coordination with our leadership switched the path from an environmental assessment or an EA to what we call a supplemental environmental impact statement. And we did that for a couple reasons. One was at the time, so essentially EISs take longer, right? Because there's more coordination, there's more requirements through the National Environmental Policy Act process. And so if we delay too long to switching, we can really impact the overall schedule. And so at a certain point, we essentially needed to know whether we were going to move forward with an EA or an EIS. And so at that time, we said, okay, well, there's still some measures that we're looking at that have like direct ocean outlets that would be significantly impactful to the environment. And because of that, right, those measures are still in the plan, may as well switch to an EIS. EISs are also more transparent, right? And so regardless of whether those measures move forward, it does increase the transparency of the overall process. And so we decided at the time to switch to an environmental impact statement. Since that time, though, the vast majority of measures that would have potentially significant environmental impacts have been screened out. And so, at the end of the day, after we made the decision, we had another discussion about whether we should switch back to an EA. Well, is an EIS necessary at this point? And at that time, the team, in coordination with our leadership, said, well, we've already started down this path. Again, it's more transparent. Let's just keep down the EIS path. And at that time, then we said, okay, we're gonna notify folks through our policy and guidance. They say, all right, submit something in the Federal Register saying, notice of intent to prepare an EIS. And so we did that back on the 22nd of February. As Tyson mentioned earlier, we failed to put out a press release associated with that. And again, we apologize about that. So we did extend that notice of intent comment period to May 8th to ensure that, folks had, that full time period to comment. And so at the same time, we also prepared a notice of intent for the supplemental EIS through the environmental notice, which is the state HEPA or Hawaii Environmental Policy Act process. And so those two things are ongoing, those two comment periods. And ultimately, again, we switched because at the time, we still had those features that we were looking at that would have potentially significant effects. And then ultimately, I say it's kind of, I don't know, we also want to increase transparency, but in an effort to do so, we failed to put out the public notice, public notice, which kind of alluded to less transparency. And so, it was kind of, I don't want to say shot ourselves in the foot there, but we apologize about that. But again, we want to maintain that transparency moving forward. So two things here. The notice of intent kicks off what we call the public scoping period. And so I want to talk a little bit about why it's a supplemental EIS and what it means for that public scoping period. So it's a supplemental EIS because there was an EIS that was completed under the 2017 feasibility study that, where those analyses are still valid, they're still good, right? And in coordination with our resource agency partners, essentially the supplemental EIS allows us to leverage the work that was done for that EIS. And then obviously we supplement it where needed, right? So we're looking at measures that were not considered under the 2017 feasibility study, we then go in and look at all of those and analyze the environmental impacts and other impacts associated with those measures. And so it essentially just allows us to maximize efficiency with how we and other resource agencies execute the EIS, only doing additional analyses where needed. What it also allows us to do, though, and I'll talk about this on the next slide, is to, we still consider all of the comments because, that was an EIS and we're supplementing it. All of the comments associated with that EIS that were part of the public record, maintain part of the public record for our study and our EIS, and they will be considered through our process. So that's kind of getting into the why it's a supplemental EIS. The other thing is the scoping process. And so this notice of intent and the scoping process that it kicks off is essentially the minimum required scoping, right? It basically says, okay, through the NEPA process, you have to incorporate the public into the scoping process. And this notice of intent is a forcing function to do that. But in reality, right, we've been having these meetings since November 2021. And we started off with scoping in those meetings. And so, you all have been part of that scoping process, the entire study essentially. And so, we do have this formal comment period for this notice of intent, but we are accepting comments through this meeting, through all other meetings, just like we always have, right? So it's just another vehicle to allow you to submit comments, or another forcing function, if you will. But in reality, all the comments that we have accepted so far will be considered equally to those that will be provided as part of this formal public comment period. Okay, Tyson, next slide. I'm talking too long. Okay, and that's what this does, right? This just says all comments received, right? Because it's a supplemental EIS, all comments received during the 2017 EIS, through the workshops to date, through this notice of intent comment period, and then comments that will yet to come through the release of the draft report and final report are all equally considered through the development of the supplemental EIS. Tyson, next slide. And then what it means for the process moving forward. So here we are technically in the scoping phase, although we have been right all along. As soon as we finish the draft feasibility report, we'll publish a notice of availability in the Federal Register. And unlike we did this last time, we will also put out a press release notifying the public of that availability and that form of public comment period. But in addition to all that, we're going to be holding 2 public meetings, one in person and one virtual, likely around the June, July timeframe, where those will be formal meetings, and during the public comment period where, you can come and provide comments and feedback and questions and so forth. We'll then take all those comments, finalize a final draft report, and then publish the draft final report. And we'll do a notice of availability for the feasibility report, and so forth. And there's, again, a time period, right, a 30-day mandatory kind of waiting period before we finalize what we call the record of decision associated with that EIS. And then the state determines overall acceptability, and then the study will be complete, right? We'll make a recommendation through the chief of engineers to Congress for the recommended plan. And so what does that mean with respect to our study process that I've been presenting all along? So Tyson, last slide, for me at least. So again, we are kind of at the yellow arrow in the middle of the slide. We're still finalizing the analyses, as I mentioned a few slides ago. Once we finalize that and undergo our internal reviews, we'll release the draft report. That will be associated with the notice of availability, the press release, and then the 2 public meetings that we'll have after we release that draft report. Ultimately, we'll take all your comments, all the internal technical comments. We're doing an external peer review, take all those comments, address them all in the final report. Ultimately, we'll be releasing the final report, November, March of this year or next year. But prior to the release of that draft report, we are planning on holding another public meeting to talk with you all about what's in that final report. I think I just said draft report. Before we release the final report, we'll have another meeting where we talk with everybody about what's in the final report. And then even after the release of the final report, we're still going to have another meeting to kind of answer any questions that you all may have, and talk about what the remainder of the study path looks like. And then ultimately, the study culminates in a signed chief's report. Again, we're still looking at spring of 2024. That signed chief's report then goes to Congress for subsequent authorization and funding of the project. Okay, Tyson, I think that's it for me.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. That was great. So I think we covered most of the ground that we did in the YouTube video. Obviously, there are a ton of questions in the chat. A lot of which were spurred by, some of the slides and comments. So hopefully we'll be able to get to all of those, or at least most of those today. I just wanted to include this information for you that, again, we are in this scoping period for NEPA and HEPA and until May 8th. And you can, in addition to comments and questions today, you can submit things online at that URL there, also by email or by postal mail, as on the screen here. And also to let you know, we've got an informal office hour. We've decided we're going to try this format, a little more informal, just discussing, whatever questions you have. We'll do that on Monday, May 15th at noon. So it'll be like a lunch hour kind of thing. And if that is useful for folks, then we can schedule some additional ones. And then, as Eric mentioned, we'll also have the upcoming workshops on the draft report and the TSP. So we're going to move into our listening session. So as I mentioned, tons of questions in the chat, really, really good questions. Some of them we've already been able to answer. Some of them we may not be able to answer today, partly because our technical lead was unavailable for this meeting. So if there are any questions that, the folks that are here now can't answer, that we need her to answer for you, then we'll take those questions back to her, and we'll provide those answers later. So either through an email that we'll send to the mailing list, or on that May 15th call. But for today, what we really want to do primarily is listen to you and your comments and your questions. So if you have questions that you want answers to now, those are certainly welcome, and you've been putting a bunch of them in the chat, and we'll try to answer those. But really, we want to spend as much time as possible actually, listening to you rather than listening to our own voices. So that's really the objective today. So if you want to provide a comment or ask a question, you can do that in the chat. Eric, you had a hot mic, so I just muted you there. So if you need to speak, just feel free to come off mute. So you can put it in the chat, or you can use the raise hand tool, which is at the bottom of your screen there, also just next to your hand or next to your name in the participant list. Again, keep your audio on mute unless you're speaking. Also, the first time that you speak, if you could just introduce yourself really briefly, let us know who you are. I think we've got a few new folks on today, which is fantastic. We were really hoping that we could expand our reach in the community. So that's really exciting. Because we do have a lot of people and there are a lot of questions, we're going to try to keep the comments brief if as possible. So, I'm not going to be like draconian with the timer or anything necessarily, unless it gets really hairy. But just a reminder to please, keep your comments brief within a few minutes. And as we open up the floor, these are just some prompts that I put together for you to think about, how you feel about this plan and what questions you might have about it. I think for most of you, you don't really need prompts. You've already got lots of questions and comments, and that's awesome. But here's some things that might be able to, help you to think about the kinds of comments and questions that you might want to contribute. So with that, I'm going to open it up for your comments and questions. And what I'll do to start is I'll go to folks who have their hands up, and then we can go to comments and questions in the chat. And I'll probably need help from my colleagues with that because there's so much there. But to start off, I see Robert Fox. You have your hand up. You want to come off of mute and ask your question or provide your comment.
Yes, I do have some questions here. In your environmental impact study, did you notice anything about our caves underneath Mo'ili'ili from the Manoa Stream? We still have very rare albino fish in the caves underneath that area. Just thought I'd mention that. The other thing that's bothering me here is raising homes, and this is supposed to be at the owner's expense. I would suggest that you copycat Long Beach, California, when we had to do an earthquake seismic retrofit of all of our buildings that were 3 stories or more. The city arranged a loan at 2% for every homeowner. And we had a time level that you had to have this done by 1992. And with that loan, they were able to do the retrofitting, which was necessary without breaking the bank, and everybody complied. Gas stations that did not comply were shut down completely. So I'm thinking, wouldn't it be nice to have an element where at least we're assisting in your plan residents who feel the necessity of raising their homes where it's not going to break the bank at 7 or 8%. A thought on that.
Sir, if I can just respond to that, just one, I don't want to interrupt you, but it would not be at the homeowner's expense. All of the non-structural features would be cost shared between the federal government and the non-federal sponsor, in this case, the city and county of Honolulu, at no cost.
Thank you for clarifying that. The response in the chat said it would be the owner's responsibility, and that rather shocked me.
Yeah,
so, I want to get us on the same page.
The only thing that the owner needs to do is to decide whether or not to opt in. It is not a mandatory. So, the homeowner, any homeowner could say, I do not want to participate, and the federal government would not force that participation. So opting in would then trigger the cost share between the federal sponsor and the non-federal sponsor.
The last part of my question here is, when you're making the berms of going up gradually, like a walking path, and then you finally get to 6 feet, is that going to be a complete cement structure, or are you going to follow the newly organized plan of the Los Angeles River, where we're making stepped up methods with plant life as well as with stone easements? What is the plan for that berm? Is that just going to be a cement structure? Because that's pretty ugly.
So the berm at the golf course would be an earthen berm. So it would be side sloped. I'm not an engineer. It would be sloped maybe 3 to 1, and it would be grass. They could put other features around it if they wanted. They could incorporate a golf course path at the top, right? There are ways that we could incorporate recreational features, but it would be an earthen berm. The walls would be normal flood walls. I don't exactly know, but they would be, historically what people would think are, just a wall, but we would try to incorporate aesthetic type features. And again, kind of we've discussed the elevated walkway that we're still considering. And so there would be features associated with that wall as well to lessen the visual impacts.
Is that going to be consistent with the Woodlawn Bridge area also? I like the idea of a walking path. That certainly makes it a little more amenable.
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and I'm not exactly sure what the so I know that those features were being looked at. The walking path was being looked at along the Alawai Canal. I'm not sure if that feature was also being considered up near Woodlawn. We can take that question down and take it back to the team.
I would appreciate that. Oh, P.S. I'm on the neighborhood board, Lower Manoa. Okay.
Okay. Thanks for your participation and your questions and comments.
Thank you.
Appreciate that, Robert. Thanks so much. Dave Watatse, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, aloha. I have a bunch of questions. First is the wall. I mean, why is the Army Corps still stuck on the wall? 7 neighborhood boards, past resolutions, couple things, they were against upstream detention basins, and they were against, high walls around the Alawai. And now you got higher walls around the Alawai. And you know, several, I think, faults in your original or final 2017 final EIS. One of them was the Hostins ditch, which seems to be eliminated. But the Hostins ditch and detention basin, I mean, and Hostins floodgate was put in place to handle the floodwaters, you know, with the elevated walls. And from what I can tell, you just like erased it. So my question is, what happens to the water coming from Mo'iliili and Macaulay, you know, when you basically shut off the existing storm drainage and you shut off the University Avenue? You guys were thinking about putting in a flood pump there, a third one, because of the volume of water coming down from the University of Hawaii and that area. That sub watershed there, again, is going to be cut off from draining into the canal. And then you had two big flood pumps to handle Diamond Head and Kapahulu and Kaimaki floodwaters at the tail end of the canal. And the way it looked like it was to operate is when you had the peak flow and the water was above ground, you'd have to pump it into the canal at the very end of the canal, and it would have to travel, 2 miles to exit at the Alawai Harbor. What are you doing with that water? I mean, it seems as though you're building a wall and not even discussing or telling the community, including Waikiki, what are we supposed to do with our internal storm drainage water when you shut it off? Now, the final EIS said you guys are going to cap it and gate it off for, around 6 to 8 hours. That's a long time to basically have our storm drainage plugged. Last year, Waikiki, 2 years ago in December, Waikiki flooded. And that was with a little storm. Our storm drain system was open, not shut. And a 50-year storm or 25-year storm, I'm still not sure what you're designing for, would cause even more flooding internally if the water from our properties had nowhere to go. So, how are you guys addressing that? I mean, what's your plan? It seems as though you eliminated the flood pumps. The Star Bulletin article mentioned possibly including flood pumps. How can we comment when we really don't know what you're going to do?
Thanks. Really good questions. Yeah, go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, so I can address that. And again, Kelly and some of our lead engineers are not on the call, and so we can take these questions back. But so we are not, capping the current storm drainage system. So, we'd be putting those flap gates or sluice gates, say on the open ditches or the sewage or the storm sewer infrastructure, right? And those gates allow water to come out, and so those drainage systems can drain out into the canal, but they prevent water from going back up in. And so all of these things are being included in the models, right? And so it's not that we're putting walls up and then just allowing it to become a bathtub and fill up, right? All of those drainage structures are in there. Now, I think on the presentation online, I did say that, the team, is looking into, all right, well, if we do add some pumps to some of those systems, can we drain right faster? Does it help reduce or, might that be of assistance? And so that's something that the team is still looking at, is kind of one of the modifications to the features that are currently in place that we're still looking at. Now the question about the larger pump system, and I think I saw Cindy started to address this a little bit in the chat. So that pump that was looked at under the last iteration, the large pump over by the golf course, was essentially put in place to help drain floodwaters from the other sides of the walls, right? Kind of, I guess, Malca of the canal, like around the golf course area. And so that was meant to allow those systems to drain faster, right? And pull that water out. But what we found is through our analyses, when we extended the flood wall up the Manoa Palolo Canal all the way up to the H1 and prevented water from essentially flooding from the canal over to the Mauka side of the golf course, it essentially removed all of that water from the systems behind the flood wall, because we were stopping the water from essentially getting out there to begin with. That we did not need the large scale pump system at that point, because the water that they were using that pump to pull out no longer was a problem, because we're preventing it from getting there to begin with. And so again, our plan is different, right, from the last plans. And so I know it's hard, right, but even minor changes in the plans from this iteration to the last iteration do have fairly significant changes on how the overall system functions. And so again, right now, our analysis and our models, right, are showing that we do not need a large scale pump system, because we're addressing that water from the source that pump system was intended to address the last time. And still, I just, to drive the point home, we are going to modify the drainage structures to prevent water from backing up and to allow water to come out of those drainage systems behind the walls on all sides. I don't want folks to think that we are not thinking about that and incorporating the features necessary to ensure that those systems drain behind the flood walls. I hope that addresses your questions, Dave.
And Dave, I'm sure you've got some follow-up questions as well. We'll come back around to you. Just want to make sure I get some other folks here. Bren, I see you've got your hand up.
Hi, thank you so much. My name's Bryn Rovito. I am a Waikiki resident and a commercial boat operator in the Alawai Small Boat Harbor. I have a question. I've been attending the neighborhood board hearing meetings here, and there was 2 projects that were brought up. One was, I think DOT is working on this, and they were talking about removing one of the traffic lanes in the Alawai along with the palm trees that line that area. And then there was another project brought up where they were considering rebuilding the Macaulay Street Bridge. And I'm not sure who's working on that, but are those 2 things being done with your plan or independently of this plan?
So I'll jump in and then I'll let anybody from the city and county chime in if they want. So they are being conducted external to our study, right? That being said, our partner is the city and county of Honolulu. And so we're absolutely coordinating with one another on each of these, right? And so as we get further along in our plans, they will, the folks that are looking at the bridge, want to make sure that their plans are incorporating what we're looking at. And then with the complete streets discussion, there is talk about, okay, well, if we're looking at a potential flood wall on, that side of the canal, how might we be able to incorporate that in with their plan, right? And so we're already thinking about how we can kind of leverage each other's ideas and plans to make sure that, they're working together and to the extent possible kind of benefiting each other. So I'll let the city and county chime in, but those are discussions that we have very frequently when we kind of get together with the city and county.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I don't know if anybody from the city wants to chime in or not, but
I have not heard of anything, any projects regarding the Macaulay Street Bridge.
I'm the Complete Streets coordinator, and talked to the new bridge of the Alawai Canal.
Renee, you're breaking up.
And is in some kind of similar structure. It's been in the Alawai are an upcoming roadway paving and rehab project for interim treatment. Thank you.
Hang on a sec.
Could I make a comment on this? I keep
hold on. Robert, hold on a second. Renee was breaking up. I don't think folks could hear what she said. Haku, do you want to jump in?
I want to jump in only in terms of the Complete Streets segment, which is the city and county as a part of that. In California, we've been dealing with the results of Complete Streets. It's a vision which probably needs to be altered because we've had incredible economic damage because of it. I'm president of the Council of Neighborhood Organizations, and the business associations of Long Beach over several years. And that bothers me a great deal. Also, I forgot to ask the question, what is there a reason why we're doing a wall on both sides of the LOI? Is there some, I didn't understand the reasoning on that. If you could explain that.
Okay, we'll get to that in a sec. I want to give Haku a chance to.
No, I hadn't heard of a Macaulay Street Bridge project, was all I was going to say in response to the question that came in. But I want to hear what Renee had to say. Unfortunately, she was cutting out, and if she's having mic issues, maybe she can type a response in the chat.
Yeah,
And then to
Oh,
clarify,
I can try again. I think it's just my internet at home. Can you hear me?
yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay, I believe the bridge is probably the LOI, the new pedestrian and bicycle bridge that's being designed by the city. I think that's what's being alluded to. And that is being designed with the flood control project in mind. And then the Complete Streets project that's currently proposed is supposed to be implemented with an upcoming road paving project. So we consider that more of an interim treatment until the flood control project gets built. Sorry, toddler time.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Eric, you want to just give a quick response to Robert's question about the walls, and then we'll get to Winston. He's had his hand up for a while.
so I'm sorry, Robert, could you ask the question one more time? I think I missed the last part.
On your map, you have walls on both sides of the LOI. I understand the reasoning why we have a wall on the Mauka side. What is the reasoning of having a wall on the LOI on the Mackay side of the canal?
So if we essentially had a wall on one side and not the other, especially in those areas, we would essentially be inducing flooding on the other side. So if we had a wall on the Malka side, but not the Mackay side, we would essentially be pushing water out into the Waikiki area, right? Because you're essentially preventing water from going out on one side, so it's got to go somewhere. So you have walls on both sides, providing equal protection from the canal on both sides.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Winston, go ahead.
Hey, yeah, I know you're up late, Eric, and Tyson. Yeah, so I put in a number of questions into the chat there, as have other people, and I don't know if you'll be able to get to those somehow, but it would be great if you could. And that leads to a few questions I had. One was, how can we see all of these comments that have been given over the last, since 2017 or before, and what responses the USA has been giving that. And as Dave said, these parameters have changed so much. We were looking at 6 or 7 detention bases originally, and now we're down to essentially one plus, I guess. So the parameters have changed so much, as has the information and the modeling. So how can we have the same EIS is one question I have. Another one is that, really you guys need to go to every single neighborhood board that's affected. This has been part of the problem from the beginning, is just you can't over communicate this, even whether people like it or don't like it. They just need to hear more and understand more. There's a lot of unanswered questions right now. I know Renee was just talking about the proposed bridge, but in fact, as that lets out, if you don't have a pumping system that forces water out on the Mo'iliili side, because the Houston Ditch and all the other things are closed, that water is going to back up in Mo'iliili just from that type of rain. So the people that would be ostensibly crossing the bridge are going into flood zones. So that also, in the original version, the USACE didn't even know or comment about the bridge. So it's so disjointed. It's hard for the common person to understand any coherence or planning in this that takes into account these larger things. I know you guys worked really hard on a lot of different data points, but we have, just some basic questions that that are germane, like Dave just said. How about the pumps? anyway, I would just encourage you to meet. Saying that there's not enough money for Zoom meetings, that doesn't inspire a lot of confidence either. So I would just make sure you make the rounds every single time to the neighborhood boards. You're going to get a lot of the same questions, but that's just part of the process. I would still consider opening up some sort of center where, you know, at UH or something, I don't know. And you know, I did have the question about the volume of water. Like Dave said, is it a 25-year flood, a 50-year flood? How fast would that fill up in the Alawai? And I noticed that because if it's, well, traffic looks like it's going to be cut off at Date and the river and Kapiolani and King at Market City. That latter location is also where a major substation would be powering your pumps. Assume that that will be flooded and or taken out. How are you going to get the water out if that is indeed flooded? It provides power to the whole area. And what would that look like? The other, you know, these are just a lot of questions I have, but yeah. So how would these, you know, actually work? The EIS itself, you know, have you considered walls that descend, like Sydney Lynch had sent around? This is very great idea where they just go into the ground and then they raise up when there's a storm. And you test them once a month to make sure, just like the air raid siren, to make sure that they're functioning. This would solve a lot of problems, but these other ideas, we've got some work to do. Let's not rush this. The money's hopefully, maybe it'll be there, maybe it won't be there, but to have some more community buy-in, I think we need to look at some of these questions because, you know, we'd be trapped on this side of the Manoa Pololo stream if in fact there's a flood, because University, the underpass at the freeway would be cut off from flooding under Ponaho. Certainly Dole would be cut off. Date is definitely going to be shut down. Kapiolani's cut off. Let's assume that leaves us only Alawai to get out. And how is Alawai going to be functioning at this point in time? So there's a lot of unanswered questions about how this looks. It's not insurmountable, but we need more time. Anyway, thank you for, and I hope you answer the questions in the chat too, if you're able to get to them.
It takes a lot of... Yeah, thank you so much, Winston. There obviously are a lot of questions there, and you just asked a lot as well.
Yes.
I just wanted to, I think I mentioned it in the chat, but if we can't get to everything today, and by the way, we're technically up against what we had originally scheduled as the end of this, so we can extend it another 15 minutes to 7 o'clock. Realize that it's fairly short today, but if we can't get to every question today to answer, we will get back to you. So we've obviously, you know, we're keeping records of the chat. We've got the recording of this. So we will try to answer your questions either by adding answers to the FAQ on the website that Matt Gonzer just put a link to, or sending out an email through the mailing list, or at our next meeting, which again will be May 15th. And you know, again, like if that meeting turns out to be useful, then we might just sort of have those on a regular basis, and we can, you know, have this ongoing conversation that way and answer those questions that way. Eric, that's
really imperative. Thank you.
Yeah, you bet. And agree, obviously, it's the more that we can do in terms of public engagement, the better. We also, you know, would like to do, you know, as much as we can. So, Eric, you want to respond to any of those, particularly the technical questions that Winston threw out there?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to drive the point home that, you know, I think Winston and Dave asked a similar question. The wall would not cut off the existing drainage systems. That is critical for folks to understand. Those drainage systems would continue to be able to function currently as they currently are. They would have gates on them that allow water to pass through, out, but not back in. And so that is critical, I think, for folks to understand. We are not cutting off existing drainage systems. They would be able to function. And then right now,
that work,
you know,
Eric,
good point.
because unless water works differently in Virginia, if you've got water on one side that's equal height as the other side, how does it drain out?
It's all about hydraulic head. Again, I'm not an engineer, right? But when you have more pressure on the outside pushing in, then the hydraulic head can push it out. And again, it's all in the modeling, right? So it's not,
Right. Yeah,
all of these things are incorporated into the analyses. I think that's also important to understand.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. So I do want to, I think some of these things, like this particular point, you know, I think we could spend a lot more time sort of digging into the nitty-gritty details, you know, of the technical, how it works. But unfortunately, we don't have that time today. So maybe that's something, for example, we can do on May 15th. If people are interested in that, we can talk a little more about that. I see a bunch more hands up. So I want to try to get to all those hands before we close in about 15 minutes. If those of you who have your hands up, if you could just try to keep things relatively brief, that would be great. So then your neighbors will also be able to speak. So I'll start at the top. Sam.
Okay. Hi there, guys. Thanks so much for putting this on today. My name's Sam. I'm a student at UH Manoa. I just have one quick question for Eric. How do you hope to effectively plan and manage this really local project from thousands of miles away? I'm just curious how you are navigating that and feel that you're getting the best results that you can.
So that's a great question, Sam. So I think it's also critical to note that, so I am 1 PM of 2, and Cindy Okpal is our project manager forward, who sits, she's in the Honolulu district office, right downtown Honolulu. And so, you know, although I am not on the island, right, I am, you know, I bring expertise. But then we have those folks like Cindy that are on the island that allow kind of that touch point and continued engagement. And so I think, you know, the success of the study and the success of the team is in the diversity of the team, to be honest. And so, but having that touch point on the island is absolutely critical.
Yeah, and I would add, I mean, I think it is a good question. You know, we have other members of the team that are Honolulu district folks. And clearly, you know, these meetings are critical for getting that local perspective. And we have done, you know, some site visits. So for some of the folks from the mainland, you know, have gone there and done some site visits and that kind of thing. So absolutely, totally agree that a local perspective is critical.
And I think,
yeah,
Tyson, we would be remiss if we didn't talk about the city and county, right? So the city and county are, as our local sponsor, I mean, they are the city and county, right? And so they are extremely active. They are integrated into our study team. They attend multiple meetings every week. And so essentially, you know, we have them as key members of the team kind of contributing at all levels, you know, in all aspects of the study.
Yeah, and that's not something that you see on every Corps of Engineers study, by the way. So the city's administration has been super active and like Eric said, integrated. So that's a good question, Sam.
Yeah, thank you so much. Do you know what the percentage on the Army Corps of Engineers side is between Honolulu-based and not Honolulu-based?
I don't know numbers for you, but we got some both. We got both. So I do want to get to our other questions though, but appreciate that very much. Whitney.
Oh, thank you. I would like to just say that I think it's quite odd that the technical person who should be answering all of the questions for folks here is not here when you guys are the ones who set this meeting. And I would say that in future, you know, like if this is meant to be a time, there were a number of comments in the beginning about how we wanted to get to allowing people to have questions in like a question and answer period and allowing people to hear from us. And yet there seems to have been very little time. We're already apparently over the time that was initially allotted for that question and answer period. So there was both very little time and no one to answer those questions even present at this meeting. And I would say, along with sort of what Winston said earlier about reaching out to neighborhood boards and being present in neighborhood board meetings to do question and answer, you know, for everybody who is affected in these areas, you need to have the people who can answer those questions if you're asking the community to ask questions of you. Because, you know, saying that the questions are going to be answered some later date, potentially in a FAQ buried somewhere on a website, is really not transparent nor efficient, I think.
Well, the idea of putting answers in the FAQ would be so that everyone would have access to them if those are questions that a lot of people have that are being asked repeatedly. That's the reason that I said that. But I think that hopefully we've been able to answer, I feel we've been able to answer most of the questions here. You know, there are a few technical details that we haven't had time to dig into, so I don't know if it really, you know, even if Kelly was here, I don't know if we'd have time to do that, but I definitely appreciate the perspective, Whitney. Eric, you want to respond quickly, or should I move to Mike?
Well, I mean, I think it's just important to note that we can't control all the personal things that happen in everybody's life in the team. And we do try to hold these meetings and make sure everybody's available to answer questions. And so I just ask for a little bit of grace in that, you know, we try to hold these meetings, we try to have these meetings and provide these forums, but we can't control what happens in personal lives. And so I think just want to keep that out there for everybody. And, you know, you're right. Probably talked longer than I should have, right? But I think the point here is that, you know, we can take some of these questions back, and if there's a specific question, technical question that can't be answered, we can absolutely have an answer sheet, right, that gets posted on the website with those questions and answered, and not intended to bury them. And so, you know, your point's well taken, and I appreciate the comment. But, you know, just note that we're trying to be here. We're trying to answer questions. And again, wish our technical lead could be here as well. But unfortunately, you know, she was unable to. So, but appreciate the comment.
Yeah, and I'll just quickly add that I think that, you know, this has been from the beginning of the study an ongoing conversation, right? And so I think that, you know, that will continue. We'll keep having additional meetings and other forums for communication. Mike, go for it.
Yeah, thank you. So it's ironic that a bunch of the people that came before me said the exact things that I wanted to say. So I think you guys, three things. One is when you put walls upward and those walls upward are there to contain water, that raises the elevation of the water. And it's illogical to think that anything outside those walls is going to drain into an elevation that's higher. So nothing's going to drain into a canal that walls are going upward, because the walls are there to bring the elevation up, allow the elevation to come up. So the modeling that you referenced, Derek, and all of the technical details that we're not getting from these meetings are because the engineering lead isn't leading these meetings, isn't presenting. And models are very difficult for the community to, just to say that it was modeled. Okay, we trust you, we're good, let's move on, let's just go with walls. So it's kind of a waste of my time to attend these meetings if we don't have engineering, technical explanations as to why we don't need to lower the elevation of the canal to deal with drainage, to deal with sea level rise, groundwater inundation, to deal with storm surge, all of it. And you have to be honest with the people who live in this area, which I don't. You have to be honest with them and say, we're just fixing riverine flooding. By the way, you're still going to be flooded from storm surge and sea level rise, groundwater inundation, because we are not lowering the level in the canal. We are allowing it to go up, which means nothing's going to drain into it during those periods. And then as far as that, I'm sorry that somebody couldn't make the meeting, but unless we see the reality of these models, instead of just saying it was modeled, it doesn't, there's no rubber hitting the road for us. So I'm with everybody else that's commented right before me. Steve Holmes, everybody else, we're on the same page. We need to see why we're going with walls everywhere and we're not evacuating water and we're not allowing drainage. Thank you.
Yeah, and hey, Mike, appreciate that comment. And so, you know, it is a challenge, right? Like, so again, Kelly's not here. It's unfortunate, but she was unable to. And so, but all of these things, right, will be incorporated into the draft report, right? All of the analyses, all of the modeling. And so, you know, it is tough. It's a challenge, right? So how much of the technical details do you get into for folks, right? I know somebody like yourself could understand a lot, right?
Yeah,
Meaning like
and
we'll
by
show
the
you
way,
a model.
nobody's ever reached out to me. It's like I attend, but nobody is anybody really like want to use my engineering background or Steve's or any of the other engineers that are volunteering to try to help, because we want to be on your side. We don't want to fight and say, well, what about this? What about that? But it's a one-way communication. So that nobody has ever reached out to me, or I don't know about any of the other engineering people on this volunteer thing, but I'm not an expert, but I did present some pretty significant ideas and got nothing back.
Mike, thanks for the comment. Yeah, you know, we've of course tried to analyze everything, you know, give everything equal weight in our analysis process, and you know, that kind of thing. So, you know, also I just want to say with respect to the process, you know, the approach that we've taken on this iteration of the study has been to try to ensure that everyone has equal opportunity to participate. And, you know, we'll have to shift in some ways because of just the stage that we're at now and the NEPA process and so forth. So it will be necessary to reach out to some specific folks. But you know, things can get really complicated when you do a lot of targeted outreach to specific groups, particularly early on in a process. And so we were trying to make sure that, again, that everybody sort of had an equal opportunity to provide input. But, you know, obviously we will be reviewing how everything has gone. We are getting close to the end, but we have a bunch of more hands up, and I do want to get to those if I can. So, Ellen, you've had your hand up for a while.
Thank you. A couple of one comment and one question. Comment is Cindy's out at Fort Shafter, so she can come to the neighborhood board meetings, no problem. She's on island, she's here. We need the woman to show up. When Jeff Herzog was here, he showed up. So Cindy, you're up. And the next thing is that you took Manoa Valley District Park out of your prospective plan, your incremental alternative 5, and I'm really grateful for that. But you haven't included, when you sent out your notice of intent to see if unions were interested in going to be able to build on the construction work. So how do those things square, that your prospective plan was developed after you sent out in the Federal Register, you published your notice of intent? Or how can we be assured that you're not gonna blink your eyes and put a flood detention basin back in there?
So let me just quickly, Eric, you can add to this if you want. Yes, the notice of intent was published before, you know, a lot of these details were refined that you see in the prospective plan. I addressed this in an email, but I'll just quickly mention the unions that Ellen was referencing. Was an email that some folks in the community received, which came from a consultant in Washington, D.C., who his job is to read the Federal Register, and he for his clients who are contractors and labor unions. And so he sent a message to his clients letting them know, hey, there's going to be a project here, and you might get some work out of this. So that's what that was. So that was not us communicating with them, but this guy. So anyway, and Eric, I don't know if you want anything you want to add to that real quick.
I think you covered it, Tyson. I'm sorry. To be honest, I was reading the chat, and so I missed part of Ellen's question.
No, there's a lot in there. But Ellen, I definitely appreciate that, and obviously we have the recording, and we'll make sure that we get back with anything that we need to. All right, so I want to go to Robert now.
Thank you. I was reviewing your paperwork, and your job when you're doing an environmental impact report is to take everything into consideration. I really appreciate that. I'm going to throw something really crazy out here in the world. This year has been really extraordinary. If you haven't noticed what happened to California, Washington, Oregon, Arizona, and since I have interest in both the mainland and here in Hawaii, I was asking our people what's going on. And my understanding is that the federal government is now looking into the shift of the jet stream. I think that's pretty important for us in Hawaii, particularly since we're in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And even this last week, we noticed that we had a storm come in from the southwest. Hardly ever happens. Oahu has always been sort of like a protected island. But have we taken into consideration the element of the jet stream? What is our projection for precipitation? I think that's important for this flood zone thing. Is it a 50-year flood? Is it a 10-year flood? I mean, it changes all of the elements. And the other part that Ellen and I talked about the other evening, which I think is really important, and that is soil percolation. When you're doing this study, the aquifers of Hawaii are tremendously important. What we're terribly concerned about is how do we maintain a pure aquifer, particularly in Manoa, because we have our own, wonderful aquifer. And we've had horrible situations where monster homes have been built and they cemented the entire lots. And I'm next to one. So, I mean, no drainage off of that land. So it's like 8 inches deep every time it rains going into the storm drains. And it doesn't get into the storm drains because it's so deep. Have we taken into consideration, because you're looking at all aspects of this, about the effect of non-percolation of the soil in your solution?
So, yeah, so we are kind of mandated by the Corps and our processes and guidance and engineering policy to incorporate, you had mentioned climate change, right? So changing jet streams to the extent that we can. And I mean, there's still a lot of uncertainty surrounding that, but so how is climate change and changing, weather patterns going to affect the overall project moving forward, as well as sea level rise? And so we have to consider how the sea level is going to rise and what that's going to do to water table levels, infiltration and things like that. And so all of those are incorporated into the analyses. I think off the top of my head, I want to say that by 2080, we're assuming our models assume over 3 feet of sea level rise. And so the project is, all of these alternatives are built with those changes in mind, right? And so when we talk about our future without project condition, meaning what's the future going to look like if we don't do anything? And that's ultimately what we compare all of our alternatives to. Those basal assumptions of sea level rise, and then that changing climate are kind of incorporated into that, right? And then when we go and we start designing and building out what these plans will look like and what they need to look like, again, all of those things are incorporated. And so yeah, all of that is considered in these plans. And so, for example, one great example is the detention basin at the golf course, right? So, in other parts of the country, right, if you want to maximize storage, you might excavate, create more storage area in a space, but we can't excavate there because essentially the water table will be so high that any excavation, you're just digging down into the water table. And so you don't actually get any additional storage. And so all of that is considered into the development of the plans. I hope that answers your question, Robert.
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, appreciate that. Okay, we'll close out with Vanessa and Sam. So Vanessa, go for it.
Aloha, thank you. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay, so I have two questions. The first is to follow up on a question that I asked in person last summer when we met at the Alawai Clubhouse. I had asked about the level of engagement with the Native Hawaiian community, and I'm just wondering about that. And then the second question is the City and County Department of Facility Maintenance Director has sent notice that she's accepted a position at a private engineering firm now. So I'm just wondering who is now the person that is attending your Army Corps meetings to represent the city administration. Thank you.
Thanks, Vanessa. Well, we have a number of folks from the City and County of Honolulu attending our meetings from multiple departments. Obviously, Haku Millis is sort of the lead for the city with respect to this project, but other folks have been attending as well. So yeah, it's quite a few folks, including Dawn's second.
So I will say real quick, even though DDC has kind of taken the lead as representative of the administration in coordination with the Army Corps, Department of Facilities Maintenance, former director Dawn Sevchek, and her deputy Warren Mamizuka has attended our weekly meetings. Warren is now the acting director, so he will continue to be involved for DFM.
Thanks, Haku. Yeah, great question. Okay, and Sam, you got the last
wait,
word,
what
man.
about the first question? I'm sorry to interrupt. The question about the Native Hawaiian community
Oh,
engagement.
I'm sorry. Yes, very good question. So, yeah, we have been looking at that. We are actually, I think that there are some special requirements under NEPA to reach out to Native Hawaiians and so forth. So that's one consideration. But we have been looking at, what is the appropriate forum to do that? Should we be, making sure that folks are able to come to these meetings? Are there other channels or mechanisms and so forth? Haku, is there something you wanted to say on that?
No, I was just gonna say, I know there's nothing right now that I can explain, but there have been meetings, including the city administration, on how to best approach this. So, I appreciate the question for sure. It's not something that we have pushed aside or anything, and is a topic of discussion regularly for us.
Absolutely. Yep, great question. Okay, Sam. Sam, you want to come off mute?
Thanks, Tyson. So my question is, who decided the objectives for this study? Was anybody consulted in deciding the objectives, and how did that process go to select the objectives? And then the follow-up for that is, as the managers of this project, how do you feel about the objectives, and do you think that they fully address the issues that we're going to be facing in the future?
So I can answer that question. So great question, Sam. So you're kind of getting back to the planning process in the Corps. And so from the very early stages of the study, right, we are in kind of what we call the scoping process. And so we held a couple meetings. We held internal meetings, but we also held meetings with the public through that scoping process. And so, you know, we did ask for input on problem areas. What are things that the community is experiencing? We had a few really neat tools like Crowdsource Reporter where folks could go in and put, you know, specific, hey, we flood here and so forth. And so I would say that, you know, the objectives were a collaborative effort, right? And so internally the team talked about the objectives. We had our meetings with the public, and then we also kind of presented those objectives to everybody and said, hey, does this capture, you know, the problems that we're experiencing? And so I think, Sam, your question also kind of hits at, you know, both now and in the future, right? And so I think, as I mentioned, we do take into consideration, you know, climate change, sea level rise, and so forth. But it's also important to remember that this study, and I think Winston alluded to it earlier, that this is a flood risk management study, and that means that we focus on riverine flooding, and that is what we are authorized and directed to look at as the Army Corps of Engineers. And so that is kind of the scope that we live in, right? And so we do consider, though, how things like sea level rise and storm surge affect riverine flooding, right? So how does sea level rise affect the water that's coming down the mountain, and how that ultimately results in kind of inundation of nearby communities? And so, so within the kind of context in the world that we're living in, and understanding that it's a riverine study, right, those objectives were kind of built around that. First being life safety risk, and then the second being economic damages and impacts to tourism. And so, yeah, I think, you know, just at the end of the day, it's a collaborative effort to develop and kind of vet those objectives with everybody through the scoping process. Over.
All right, thanks so much.
Yeah, and I'll just add real quick to that. I mean, it's such a perceptive question, Sam, because you obviously, you know, you're understanding that the way the project is scoped just frames everything, right? It sets you on a particular path, and you know, this is something that Professor Luciano Minervi has talked about in previous calls. You know, he has said, hey, why can't we do this as an integrated water resources management plan, which would be a multi-purpose thing, and you know, that would be the ideal. And I don't think we disagree with that, but part of what you're getting at is sort of this larger process of how do these projects come to be? They come to be through a complicated process of, you know, people working with their representatives in Congress, with, you know, those representatives talking to local governments and so forth. And, you know, things sort of bubble up that way to Congress, and then Congress passes the authority for the project, which again, in this case, is a riverine flood risk management project. And then after that, they pass an appropriations, right? So they pass, you know, they actually fund what they previously authorized. And so we have to look at the language in the authorizing language as well as the appropriating language, and make sure that we are doing what, you know, Congress is asking us to do. So that's where a lot of, you know, sort of the pre-scoping gets done, let's say. So yeah, and then obviously within that, you know, we can identify specific objectives. So really good question. Okay, so we are over, and appreciate y'all hanging with us and being patient with us and everything. So thank you so much for all the great questions. Again, there's some ways that you can stay engaged. We hope that those of you who were new today will stick with us and come back. Again, the next one will be Monday, May 15th, during lunch hour. And that'll be a relatively informal chat where, again, you'll be welcome to ask a lot of questions. And once again, we will record this chat and record the video. All of that should be available on the website within the next few days. It came to my attention earlier, by the way, that the video for the December workshop is not there. we'll have to check on that and make sure that that's also available for you to download if you'd like to see it. So that brings us to the end today, and we are looking forward to seeing you again very soon. Mahalo.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining.
Have a nice night.
Thanks, y'all.
Eric, I don't know if you have to go, but Valerie just asked a good question in the chat if you're up to address that.
Thanks, Sam. When she says both issues,
I think it's referring to what Tyson said earlier about considering the idea of like an integrated watershed management plan, something that would, promote ecosystem health and quality of life within the neighborhoods as well as just flood prevention. So yeah, I mean, it seems like when we're working with something that's going to be in place for decades, might be worth taking the time to do something that, can allow the ecosystems and the people that live in these places to have access to their water and, not just lock them away from it and the water away from them for these big flood events. Which I get that that's like kind of above your purview at this point. But if you have any thoughts on it.
Well, I will throw in, Sam, that one thing that we have talked about is, obviously there are these other authorities that the Corps of Engineers has broadly. So there could be other projects that could address some of these issues. And so it's just a question of, would the city be interested? Are there other local sponsors that would be interested? Those kinds of things. But yeah, those would be additional projects.
Sure.
So
currently the Board of Water Supply is actually working on that, and they have they've been working with some grants with DLNR, State's Department of Land and Natural Resources. They've also provided some money to look into the Alawai watershed and looking at albizia removal, invasive species removal. Internally, we're also DDC is looking at potential ways to expand on that, but we really need a partnership through other departments. Because we don't actually control any land in these areas, but it's definitely something we are looking to because we can see it being a positive aspect to the overall picture and getting to exactly what you're talking about.
Yep.
Yeah.
Great. Yeah, thanks so much, Sam and everybody. Really appreciate it today. Obviously, got a lot of really good questions, and so we will do our best to continue to answer them in future engagements.
Thank you. If I reach out to alawai at honolulu.gov, do you know who'd be answering?
It goes to the whole team, actually.
Okay, awesome. Thanks. Yeah, I'll probably reach out with some follow-ups. But yeah, I appreciate the time you're taking today.
That'd be great. Thanks, guys. Okay, I'm going to stop recording and shut her down.
All right. Take care, everybody.
Cheers.